Greenwald. Glenn Beebe, welcome.
Hi, baby.
Hey, what do you mean? I've been on your show before. I've talked to you guys before. Who are you?
Once before.
You know what?
Before-
That's right. It was so memorable. I really enjoyed it. I'm so grateful you guys decided to have me back on. And Siraj, I really don't think it's acceptable to just like forget the name of your guest show right as you're introducing
Glenn,
them.
I only know you by your name. Everything else is like secondary. It's
All
Glenn.
right,
It's Glenn Greenwald, host of what? You were at the
Well, it is funny because I have a show on Colin.
System Update.
There you go.
Yeah, I know why. I know why I forgot. I know I forgot, Glenn. I know.
Yeah, I have my show on Colin called the Glenn Greenwald Podcast, and every time I say it, I'm always just a little bit ashamed that like we never bothered to make it more inventive. There's so many podcasts and shows, and just like drowning people with new names for everything just makes no sense.
But Glenn, I remember now why I forgot the name. It's because it's called System Update, and I'm a boomer who's terrible with technology. So I'm the worst Pakistani IT guy ever.
Absolutely. He makes a lot of his uncles embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't really need, for your job at the call center, you don't need like a lot of technical expertise, do you?
You just need to know how to turn it off and on.
That's
what he's missing. He doesn't even know how to restart his computer.
That's also true. Now, as a condition to do this live stream with us, Glenn requested a few things, but one of which was a cake, naming him Habibi of the Year, which is exactly what I got, Glenn.
Oh, that's so nice. I mean, the idea was really supposed to be that it was supposed to be something I could consume, not just look at from a distance. I appreciate the sentiment.
You want me to mail it to you?
Yeah.
Glazed donuts too. I mean,
mailing to Brazil is really fast. It'll get here in like October. So I think
it's Glenn #1 Hearty, Habibi of the Year.
Thank you. I'm so honored. So honored by that designation. I appreciate that. It's one of the most special moments of my career.
I'm so glad to hear it. I hope it trumps all the honors that you've received over the course of your career.
Everyone. Absolutely.
So, Glenn, we're so glad you're here. You've been very busy in general, but ever since this whole conflict broke out in Ukraine with Russia invading 2 weeks ago, it has been a strange time to be in. So my first question to you is, does something feel off about all this?
I think actually something feels familiar about it, in the sense that I think traditionally whenever the United States is in some way involved in a war, either directly or peripherally, or obviously we're somewhere in the middle here, we're supplying arms, we're clearly on one side, we're taking all kinds of steps to help one side over the other. So we're, a direct participant, even though not militarily, and hopefully it'll stay that way, but still generally this kind of jingoism arises, a kind of tribalistic sense of unity, this pride in the virtuousness of our national values. And I think for a few decades, probably beginning with the war in Vietnam, and then certainly because of the war in Iraq, the confidence that Americans had in the Pentagon and their military and their government and their intelligence community eroded significantly. And I think there was a lot of skepticism, healthy skepticism, along with reduced skepticism toward the idea that the United States should be asserting itself into every conflict and using its superior power in order to resolve it in one way or the other. And I think it's all but gone, at least for the first 3 weeks of this war. We seem to have this very revitalized sense of our own exceptionalism, the belief that this time our intelligence community got it right, the CIA is back, we're really effective in the way we're uniting NATO and isolating Russia, and we're clearly on the morally, unambiguously moral side, and that has kind of rejuvenated this nationalistic sense that often emerges, and not just from one political camp or the other, but very bipartisan. I mean, there's almost no daylight at all between the Republican and the Democratic parties and the corporate media. And so I guess I would more describe that as familiar than off, but in some sense, we haven't really seen it since probably September 11th. And so maybe in that sense, it is a little off, that it's kind of this old familiar feeling that we thankfully hadn't seen for a while until this month.
Jay?
Right. I mean, and we see like the typical players like
Hey Jay, what's your
Lindsey Graham.
Twitter name again? I forgot. I wanted to note that down.
It's at Assliken, ASSLIKEN.
All right, thank you. Good. I have it.
You're welcome. It's the 14th one, so I was getting creative with a handle, and I think that one stuck really well.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. But I was what I was bringing up was the familiarity that I find in it is the same people like the Lindsey Grahams, the Adam Lickfingers. Yeah, Kinzinger. Thank you. I call him Adam Lickfingers, and how they are calling for actual boots on the ground. They're calling to escalate this even more to like, put the nail in Putin's coffin and everything. And is it because they are so intertwined with the military industrial complex, or is it because they have this fake sense of patriotism?
I think people are just getting carried away with this intense emotional.
Did we lose Glenn?
And I tried to kind of grapple with this before, obviously, and I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You basically cut out at the very beginning of your answer.
Yeah. So can you hear me now? Is everything okay?
Yeah, we're
now?
good. We're good.
Yeah, we're good
now.
Okay. So what I was saying was, I think that what's really going on is that people are getting very carried away by this intense emotionalism that this war, in my view, uniquely is fostering. And I tried to grapple with this, understanding why. Obviously, the days and the weeks after the 9/11 attack was also a time of extraordinary unity, but also great emotion. There was a lot of anger and rage at the people who attacked the United States. Rightfully so. I mean, that was a morally atrocious attack, and there was this kind of joint nationalistic purpose in making the people who did it pay and preventing another attack. But I actually think that in some ways, even as kind of emotionally turbulent and traumatizing as that moment was, and as intolerant to dissent as it was a little bit of I think you can really make the case that it was actually more rational and more sober, especially once a few days elapsed where there were people starting to question whether the Patriot Act was a good idea, whether the war in Afghanistan made sense. Obviously, as we built up to the war in Iraq, there was a fair amount of dissent that flourished. And I think that the difference here, it shouldn't even be comparable to 9/11 because in this case, the huge difference is our country has not been attacked at all. No one's threatening to attack our country.
Yeah, and plus January 6th was 69 times worse than 9/11. We all know this, right?
Yeah, and Pearl Harbor and the Holocaust combined.
Exactly.
So obviously January 6th is nothing should ever be compared to that most sacred day of January 6th. But leaving that aside, I think the big difference is social media. I think the fact that people are just glued to their computer screens, and then of course cable also plays a big role, but social media in particular, where everything is curated. If anyone is raising doubts or dissent or questioning that's bothering you, you can just with a button make
Spencer, you're fired.
Remarkable, and I'd say incomparable instrument of kind of groupthink and dissent intolerance, and in a lot of ways having people, not just in the United States, but throughout the West, all feed on the same information, the same emotionality, the same messaging, the same rage constantly, day after day, hour after hour. I think it's producing a kind of inebriation that is even more irrational than what happened right after 9/11.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that, I guess what I'm noticing in all of this is that there has been, as you mentioned before, no daylight between the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as the corporate media, and how they're approaching the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's somewhat startling considering the times that we're living in which basically everything has become a culture war or a partisan issue. So the idea that everyone seems to be unifying behind a particular cause, putting a lot of our differences aside, I guess is probably a bit unnerving to me. And if anything, unsettling, because again, we are so divided as a country. Why is it that we somehow unite for a country that's all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, one of the poorest nations in the in Europe, and basically outmanned and outgunned by the entire Russian Federation?
Yeah, it's bizarre for so many reasons. I mean, and I can think that what's important to point out is this lockstep unity is not just on the very narrow moral question of whether Russia's invasion is unjustifiable or whether Putin is bad, right? That's like a very narrow proposition that I can understand people more or less agreeing to. Is there's only one country getting bombed and whose civilians are being killed, and that's Ukraine. And it doesn't surprise me that we're kind of looking at that and seeing the images every day and empathizing with the country that's being, targeted by a much more powerful military with bombardment and shelling and all kinds of horrific scenes. It goes way beyond that. It's not that moral consensus is then transmitting into these policy realms of, well, what should the United States do about it? Should we just kind of keep our distance on the ground that it's not worth risking, like a nuclear war for defense of Ukraine? Should we really be collapsing the Russian economy? Isn't that kind of in some way unjust to make Russian civilians suffer, given our view that Russia is not a democracy and chose its government, but instead is this like despotic, totalitarian dictatorship, as the mainstream saying goes? And isn't it kind of risky as well to collapse the economy of a country that has more nuclear warheads than any other on the planet, including the United States? What about the ongoing role of NATO, which is supposed to be this defensive alliance that suddenly now is very involved in defense of a country that's not a member of that alliance? And what about the risk there? None of these questions are permissible, because they all seem as though where by raising them, siding with the Russians, to say nothing of things like, what about all these weapons that are being flooded into Ukraine? Like, we should have learned our lesson, I would have thought, in Afghanistan and Syria, where we did the same things to prolong wars, to turn it into this grueling insurgency. And those weapons fell into the hands of all kinds of people we say we wouldn't want to have armed. And that created all kinds of blowback for many years to come. Who are getting these weapons in Ukraine? My guess is there are a fair amount going to the most extremist factions. That's who always ends up doing the hardest core and most aggressive fighting, and that the nation kind of rallies behind. That's what happened in Syria. That's obviously what's happening here. I'm sure there's neo-Nazi battalions getting very sophisticated weaponry that they're going to have for a long time to come. So the problem is not that everyone's in agreement that the invasion was wrong and Putin is bad. The problem is that is then generating consensus on almost every policy issue that follows. And whereas 3 weeks ago, it was totally taboo to bring up the idea that we should have a no-fly zone because it's insane, because we would be clearly risking a nuclear exchange by doing that. Although it's still a minority of people who advocated, although the Western leaders are still pretty steadfast in saying they don't want to do it, every day that goes by, more and more people in the mainstream are standing up and advocating either that or something very similar, like sending fighter jets or other kinds of things that have long been considered acts of war. And I feel like we're not moving away from this hysteria, but we're immersing ourselves in it more and more as each day goes by. And I'm concerned where that's going to take us.
Right.
Jay?
And what you pointed to earlier as well is like social media, and they're showing us every single day trying to get this sympathetic reaction out of people so they can also back the war itself. And the more that we see these things, the more they're trying to play on the sympathetic strings of the public. And it's really funny because, like you were saying, we had David, what's his name? David Foom, and then Joy Reid, both from talk about how either you're behind this presidency or you're with Putin. Like those are the only two options you get. And both of these guys are supposedly like on different ends of the political spectrum, saying the same message to everybody. And it's just weird to see this happening.
One of the things I realized during Russiagate, I remember the first time Russiagate emerged as a campaign theme. It was this dark, sinister, innuendo-laden campaign ad from the Clinton campaign, basically with dark music and all kinds of, deep voices raising questions about what's really going on between Donald Trump and the Kremlin. What's their
Is Glenn
relationship?
Greenwald really a Russian asset?
Exactly. Like flash my phone, my face on for like a second subliminally. I remember being surprised that more people didn't recoil from that, because one of the things that my politics and my ethos is based in is one of the worst civil liberties crises of the last half of the 20th century, which is the McCarthy era. So when people start invoking that theme almost verbatim, like who is a clandestine agent of the Kremlin and who is Russia secretly controlling and who has misplaced loyalties to the United States, I just have an instinctive aversion to it. And one of the things that I realized as I saw that way fewer people than I expected to have that similar reaction did was that one of the reasons history repeats itself is because every generation that's emerges into adulthood didn't actually live through it, and therefore don't know about it. They either only know it from a kind of clinical distance, having not lived through it, or they don't know about it at all. And so what is again surprising to me about this framework of you're either on the side of the president of the United States or you're with the Russians is that was exactly the binary framework imposed by George Bush and Dick Cheney in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack. And it was David Frum, as a Bush White House speechwriter, who wrote those early speeches by George Bush, disseminating that logic. Bush on September 20th, 9 days after the 9/11 attack, went before a joint session of Congress and notoriously pronounced, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And so to watch the very same people 20 years later, Bill Kristol and David Frum and Nicole Wallace and Matthew Dowd and all these people who worked inside the Bush White House and the Bush-Cheney orbit, disseminating exactly the same theme and being applauded by liberals who had been the target of that is, in the first instance, kind of shocking until you realize that you're talking about millions of people again who didn't live through that, who don't know who David Frum is except his nice, good anti-Trump incarnation since 2016. Right. And I think it has produced this perfect storm of Democrats who have been feeding on hatred for Russia since 2016, when they were told that it was the fault of Putin that Hillary's coronation didn't happen and Donald Trump was elected. So they've been fed conspiracy theories about Russia for years. The Russians have taken over the United States through blackmail control of Trump, the PP tape, all of that, the Steele dossier. They've been being trained and accustomed to view Russia as this grave enemy of the United States for many years now in a way that was predictably dangerous. And then on the right, you always have this kind of latent, lurking militarism. It's like a kind of tough guy mentality. The right, before Trump, was almost entirely driven by this idea that when there's war, we go and we kick ass and show everyone who's boss. Trump created a pretty non-trivial segment on the right that is now much more questioning of American militarism. That's one of the, in my view, most valuable things he did. So there is a non-trivial segment on the right and on the left that's dissenting, but still the right, more or less like the kind of Mitt Romneys and Lindsey Graham's and Marco Rubio's, those types. Soon as a war breaks out, they're right back to this kind of like, yeah, we're the superpower, we're exceptional, we're the indispensable country, as Joe Scarborough said, and we're going to go kick ass. And I think this kind of dual track motivation for Democrats and Republicans has created this really disturbing unity, again, not just on the question of the moral issue, but on the policy issues as well.
Yeah. So shifting gears just a little bit, we're still on the topic of Ukraine. This was a story that has sort of taken, I wouldn't say the world by storm, but definitely conspiracy theory land by storm. And at least for those with inquisitive minds and are basically open to exploring and ask and are willing and intellectually honest enough to ask those questions. Glenn, your latest piece on Substack was covering the comments made by Victoria Nuland, who is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She sat in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she was asked a question by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida about whether Ukraine has bio-research or biological weapons within Ukraine. And she gave a very puzzling answer. His exact question was, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons? And in your piece, you wrote that she basically said something completely uncharacteristic, is that she told the truth for like a minute before Marco Rubio cut her off to try to make sure that if any chemical or biological weapons attack ever occurred, it was 100% going to be the fault of Russians. Now, having basically been asking a lot of questions about this, what have you really learned since that initial exchange? And what can we really, I mean, the disinformation machine is very strong. And how are we so sure that these are similar bioresearch labs like the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, or something with maybe far more dangerous and lethal pathogens that are used for probably more nefarious purposes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and important topic. The Russians and the Chinese have been accusing the United States for weeks, if not longer, but weeks in connection with this conflict, of maintaining and cultivating in partnership with the Ukrainians a sophisticated and dangerous biological and chemical weapons program right on the other side of the border with Russia. And the Russians claim that they discovered documents that corroborate this. The Chinese say that their satellite and intelligence apparatus have proven that it's true. I never mention it because I don't trust the assertions of the Chinese and Russian government. I don't take it as true unless there's evidence presented. I wish people treated the pronouncements of the US government in a similar way. But the reason Marco Rubio asked Victoria Nuland that question was because he was aware that this was circulating in the air, and he obviously expected her to say, no, Senator, of course, Ukraine doesn't have biological and chemical weapons. Those are barred. And as a way of debunking the conspiracy, that's obviously what he was expecting her to say. And in retrospect, of course, it's what you would expect her to say, given that she's a lifelong neoconservative liar. I mean, she started off as, as Dick Cheney's national security advisor, was the NATO ambassador under George Bush, and then ran Ukraine policy for Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton adores Victoria Nuland because she's a neocon like Hillary Clinton, and now she runs Ukraine for Joe Biden as well. And so she's just kind of a revealing figure unto herself, but she typically knows how the propaganda game is played. And for some reason, she didn't just say, no, of course, Senator, Ukraine doesn't have biological and chemical weapons. She instead said, in a very kind of halting, careful, nervous tone, she said, Ukraine has biological research facilities. And the most important part is, and obviously that's a vague phrase in terms of what it means, but she gave a lot of information about how we should think about that when she quickly added, we're very concerned, she said, that these materials are going to fall into Russian hands. And we are working tirelessly with the Ukrainians to secure them and make certain that doesn't happen. And the reason that addendum was so important is because you might be tempted to try and say, oh, well, they're just kind of like high school fun labs with like some Bunsen burners and flasks. Like they mix, like water and vinegar and they watch like the little explosion happen. It's like very benign. But obviously, if it were this like benign lab like that, or something that was just about finding like a cure for multiple sclerosis or something, she wouldn't be gravely worried that they would fall into the hands of the Russians. You'd only be gravely worried if these were sophisticated and potentially dangerous materials in these labs. So that's why, and then Marco Rubio did interrupt her and said, but like, nonetheless, despite what you just shocked me by saying, you would agree with me, right? That if there is a chemical or biological weapons attack in Ukraine, it's 100% definite that would be Russia, not Ukraine. And she, of course, then realized what she had done. And she said, yeah, of course, it was 100% obviously clear that it's only Russia.
100%.
So, but the problem is, it didn't take that back. I watched it live on C-SPAN. I saw it and it doesn't go away. So the question then becomes posed to the United States government, because obviously Russia and China seized on that, was, well, what does that mean? And so the US government came out using all its organs, the Pentagon, the White House, people who take orders from the Pentagon, like Jennifer Griffin on Fox News and every other Pentagon correspondent who works on the networks. And they all came forward and said, they just issued this emphatic absolute denial. They said, the United States government does not have any biological or chemical weapons in Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter, because they're barred by convention. Now, let me just tell you why that's so interesting. Obviously, we just got done talking about the 9/11 attacks. In my opinion, more significant than the 9/11 attacks were the attacks that occurred 2 or 3 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, which were the anthrax attacks, when this extremely weaponized strain of anthrax, this very sophisticated weaponized strain manipulated in the lab, not occurring in nature, was sent through the mailbox to a variety of prominent people, and it ended up killing 5 people and injuring, I think, about a half dozen more. And the reason that was so terrifying was because, unlike 9/11, which targeted power centers in New York and Washington, this was something going to the suburbs, like appearing in people's mailboxes. And it was terrifying, like this anthrax strain that's like a biological weapon that has now been unleashed on American soil 3 weeks after the 9/11 attack. And ultimately, you know, there was about a week, people have forgotten, where they leaked to ABC News and to other media outlets that tests on the anthrax discovered that it had the characteristic markings of an Iraqi biological weapons program, that it had the presence of this substance called bentonite, which is basically nothing more than like the substance that holds together cat litter. And the argument was only Saddam uses bentonite in his anthrax, so it probably came from him. They, you know, kind of swept that aside after about a week, but it did its job. I mean, it was on David Letterman. It was John McCain talked about it all over the place. But then the FBI purported to solve the case in 2008 by claiming that they were about to arrest an Army research scientist who worked at the infectious disease lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, which happens to be under the control and command of Dr. Fauci. And right before they could arrest him, he killed himself. But the FBI story was he is the anthrax attacker. And what he did was he had obviously developed extremely sophisticated weaponized forms of anthrax that he unleashed on the public. So how is it that we know that? We know that according to the FBI, biological weapons, namely this sophisticated anthrax, came from a U.S. Army lab. And yet the U.S. government can stand up with a straight face and say, we don't ever develop biological weapons. There's a convention that bars that. The answer is that they just play this semantic game where they say the treaty bars offensive research into offensive weapons, meaning you can't do research in order to develop biological weapons that you intend to unleash on humanity. What you can do, though, is defensive research, meaning you can create the weapons as long as it's for the intention only of studying it to develop vaccines. But it's the same exact thing. Like it doesn't, if your goal were to develop weaponized anthrax, you would do exactly what the US government was doing, namely creating these AIM strains, this very sophisticated lethal strain of anthrax. So this is the same thing that we saw last year when the questions about the Wuhan Institute of Virology emerged, which is we know for sure that institute was manipulating coronaviruses that develop in nature to make them much more contagious and much more lethal. When you do that, you're creating a biological weapon. Now, of course, their argument is, yeah, but we're not doing it to unleash onto the public. We're doing it, again, just to study it, to determine how we can develop vaccines. But it's the same thing. If you were going to try and turn the coronavirus into a biological weapon, you would do exactly what the Institute of Virology in Wuhan did. And we see, even whether it was a lab leak or it was zoonotic, the potential for a pathogen like that to cause enormous amounts of sickness and death. And so this whole denial that the United States government has issued over the last 24 hours it's a joke. It's just a semantic mirage. And I still want to know, what is it about those biological research facilities that Victoria Nuland shockingly acknowledged existed in Ukraine that makes them so dangerous that she's that worried that they're going to fall into the hands of the Russians?
Before I hand it off to Jay, I believe it's because they're worried that in Ukraine, they found the cure to cancer and they don't want Russians to take credit for it.
Exactly. It's a very important thing.
Exactly what it is.
That's got to be
it.
it.
No, it's an important thing to make sure that Russian children die of pediatric cancer. You don't want them getting their hands on a cure.
Yes. All right, Jay.
In my view, I think they figured out a way to healthily eat ass after you get off the treadmill. But what's really funny about this denial is there's a track record of the American Army and government using these either pathogens or chemical weapons on either its own people, on other nations. So it really questions what is really going on. And the fact that there's nobody else, I haven't seen a report on it. I haven't seen a New York Times article on it. I haven't seen a Washington Post article on it. CNN hasn't had anybody come on to talk about these issues, because it is worrisome. What if what they're working on could be 1,000 times more potent than coronavirus, and we have no idea?
Well, first of all, let me just say, like, there was an article on September 4th, 2001. So exactly a week before the September 11th attacks, in the New York Times by Judy Miller, who ended up being discredited for her gullible reporting on Iraqi WMD. But she, at that point, up until that point, was considered to be one of the most important journalists working in the field of biological and chemical weapons development. And this article, which obviously, because it was written a week before 9/11, got completely forgotten due to historical events, but she reported that the United States government was actively developing all kinds of programs under the aegis of the CIA to make anthrax and other pathogens much more lethal, in a way that even ethics experts and diplomats inside the US government were starting to be very concerned violated treaty obligations, because there was no way to claim that that was defensive research. Beyond that, what we know for sure is that in Ukraine, there have been programs in the past that involved the development of anthrax and other biological weapons. The claim is that there was kind of like a residue from the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had put anthrax and other biological labs, weapons labs, in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and other countries that are former Soviet republics. And so we know for sure that there was, at least at some point, an active anthrax program in Ukraine. We have pictures of President Obama, then Senator Obama, with people who worked in the Pentagon on securing these materials in Ukraine, looking at anthrax labs. So again, when Victoria Nuland says these are really dangerous biological research facilities, you have to be a complete idiot, just an imbecile, to think that the conclusory denials from the Pentagon or in the White House resolve that problem. The problem is it's taboo to talk about it, because it sounds as if you're justifying the Russian invasion, or that you're, agreeing with claims of Russia and China. And the issue is that 2 weeks ago, when these claims started to emerge from China and Russia, many, many media outlets went and quote unquote debunked it under the guise of fact checking. They claimed that it was clearly a false conspiracy theory, that it was being circulated by QAnon, just like they purported to debunk all kinds of false conspiracy theories during COVID that we now know are at least viable, if not true, including the lab leak, which they very early on said only liars and conspiracy theorists would suggest this came from a lab. We know for sure it was zoonotic, and then the Biden administration a year later admitted they have no idea and are actually investigating what the real origins are of the COVID pandemic. So many things like that, where fact checking is just a way of disseminating propaganda and making it seem more high-minded. So now they're all closing ranks. They can't admit they all labeled this a conspiracy theory and now have to be open to it. So they're just doing the bidding of the government in order to protect themselves.
Yeah, it's a lot of it just seems incredibly, I don't know. It's shady. It's really shady, especially given the fact that 2 years ago, any suggestion that the coronavirus leaked from a lab was considered anti-Asian xenophobia or discrimination. It was considered, conspiracy theory of the highest order. And why would the United States be involved in gain-of-function research at this point? Why are we even calling it gain-of-function? It's, as you said, weaponization of these lethal viruses and pathogens, making them more deadly. And while, maybe the United States government and the public health sector is trying to look at how to make these viruses and pathogens more deadly to study them, at the end of the day, there seems to be very little net benefit for society, especially when people like this U.S. Army researcher with the anthrax attack takes matters into their own hands or goes rogue and basically tries to kill a bunch of people. I mean, we could have easily had so many more pandemics than we probably have had.
First of all, it's just, this whole thing about like that allusion you made to the attempt to call people who were open to the lab leak racists was always so bizarre to me, because the theory they were insisting upon as the proven truth was that the Chinese have such unsanitary eating habits. They go to these filthy, disgusting, disease-ridden wet markets and like swallow bats right there, and that's what causes diseases. I don't know. It kind of sounds a lot more racist to me than, hey, there's this really sophisticated lab that they're working in partnership with the United States to develop vaccines. And as happens sometimes in labs, there was an accident and there was a leak from the lab. I don't know. The first version sounds way more racist to me than the second, but it just shows how this racist accusation is always deployed against anybody who's saying something that you want to discredit.
Right.
That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, that's the problem, right? Is when you do all this behind closed doors. And I think this is, definitely what happened in terms of why the scientific community closed ranks so quickly after first, behind the scenes being not just open, but leaning toward a lab leak. Why they closed ranks behind Dr. Fauci and British health officials is because they knew that if the lab leak was deemed viable or possible or probable, it would bring a lot of public attention into what the scientific community does. And they don't want that attention. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do without the broader society raising ethical questions about whether these experiments are worth it. Scientists just want to discover things for its own sake, which maybe is not a bad impulse, but it's an impulse that needs to be checked, because oftentimes the dangers of finding things out scientifically outweigh greatly the benefits of finding them out. But they, I think, tried to discredit that theory because they knew it would subject their work to public scrutiny in a way that they didn't want. And I think the same is true here. The idea that the United States engages in biological weapons research, which it absolutely does, is something that will bring attention onto what scientists are doing. And again, they want to just attack as crazy or, as Kremlin agents, anybody who suggests that that's what's happening.
They try to paint everybody as being Alex Jonesy when they question these things. And it's really funny because when we're having these discussions, it does sound kind of conspiracy theory, because that's kind of what they are until we get proven facts. But the more we talk about it, the more it sounds like the truth that is out there compared to what the national narrative that they're trying to put on people. So the narrative that they try to push sounds more wacky than what we're actually trying to question and discuss, especially when it comes to the coronavirus. Fauci came on nonstop talking about the different ways we need to mandate over this coronavirus. You need to listen to your government and do what it says. All of these certain things that restrict your life over this, and he's nowhere to be seen right now. I haven't seen Fauci on TV at all as we're lifting mandates. And wouldn't you want him, the guy who was saying you have to be so scared of all of this stuff, we have to lock down everything, mask kids, all this stuff, to be the face to say everything is okay right now? Where is he? Why?
Yeah, this thing with conspiracy theories, it's so interesting. It's like the people who call others conspiracy theorists who raise possibilities that the mainstream has pronounced are false are the same people who flooded American political discourse with the most insane, unhinged conspiracy theory I ever heard, which is that Vladimir Putin had essentially infiltrated the halls of American power and taken over control of the US government through sexual, personal, and financial blackmail over the sitting president of the United States. Like, completely batshit crazy,
right?
Like, conspiracy that would come right from the film that they insisted was true. And they would use body language experts and, the way Trump stood in Helsinki and every other kind of insane, Redditor investigator. Yeah, to justify it. And then they impaneled this 18-month investigation only for Robert Mueller to close his investigation, indicting nobody for criminal conspiracy and concluding that he never found any evidence to establish these crazy conspiracy theories. Because nobody are worse conspiracy theorists than them. That's the first thing. And the second is conspiracy theory. Conspiracies exist. There are people in American prison right this moment who have been convicted of conspiracies. Conspiracies are nothing more than a group of people working toward a same goal in secret. And they do that all the time. They work together toward a common goal together in secret because they don't want anyone to know what it is they're doing. That's very common in human activity. And, here I'm in Brazil. As you guys know, I live here in Brazil. When there was a coup in 1964 against the democratically elected government, a lot of Brazilian leftists said they believed the CIA and the United States were responsible, that they engineered it, they financed it. The United States vehemently denied it. And anybody who's claimed it was, of course, branded a crazy conspiracy theorist. 5 years later, in 1969, documents began being declassified and emerging, showing that the CIA played a central role in the coup. And now, 40 years later, or 50 years later, it's established fact that that's what happened. So oftentimes conspiracy theorists end up being vindicated, but it's supposed to be a term that once it gets applied to you, it's supposed to be so inherently derogatory that everyone should stop listening to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like racist and bigot and everything. There's a meme out there with Alex Jones, and it's basically saying this is where you are in life. And it's all the conspiracy theories that turned out to be true that he's talking about in his on his show.
Yeah.
By the way, 69. I just had to say nice to that because that was quite a nice
I would be
year.
really disappointed if I came on your show and that didn't come
That
out.
didn't happen.
I just didn't want to interrupt your answer, Glenn. I'm trying to be a respectful host. Unlike when Jay says anything, he just or I say anything and Jay interrupts me immediately.
Yeah,
we have
not knowing the show of the host or the book names very professional.
Exactly. Thank you, Jay.
You're welcome.
Yes.
I got you.
You gotta get one of us has to get in your good graces. So before we take any audience questions, because we got some Rumble rants, Glenn, you have been highlighting the film Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone, which was actually removed from YouTube, and it has then been uploaded to Rumble, where it's been viewed more than 150,000 times. Now, this isn't a plug per se for Rumble, but what is interesting about it is that this is just one example in a long string of examples happening towards anything Russian related, whether it's Russian alcohol, Russian media, Russian music, anything Russian has now become taboo. And this film, Ukraine on Fire, is now being is now in the crosshairs. Why is it now all of a sudden 20 years after 9/11, 20 years after and 75 years after the Japanese internment and 100 years after the Red Scare, how is it that now Russians are back in the crosshairs? Everything that they do is bad. Doing a TikTok dance will help stop the Ukraine-Russia conflict. What the hell is going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff that you can mock for sure. Here in Brazil, the biggest city in the hemisphere is São Paulo. One of the best known restaurants announced that it was taking beef stroganoff off of its menu because of its Russian origins and solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And then today, the Brazilian Restaurant Association came out and condemned that as xenophobic. There's this whole debate and controversy over removing Russian items from the menu. So there's a lot of that kind of trivial virtue signaling idiocy going on all throughout the West, all throughout the world. But there's something a lot more pernicious, which is this, the idea of the internet was supposed to be, if you go back and read articles about the kind of triumphalist vision of it in the mid-90s and into the late 90s, was it was going to liberate us from centralized state and corporate control. That's what made it so revolutionary. It was going to enable human beings to communicate without mediation from large institutions. And what we've had starting in the middle of the Trump presidency, when Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones were depersoned by Facebook and Twitter and Google, basically everyone at once. And then obviously culminating with the removal of the sitting president of the United States by most large media platforms. And then the destruction of Parler, the site that, people would say, well, if you don't like Twitter and Facebook and how they censor, go build your own site. And the people at Parler said, okay, we'll go do that. And they became the most popular platform in the country. And then AOC went onto Twitter and demanded that Google and Apple and Amazon use their monopoly power to destroy them. And they responded within 24 hours or 48 hours, and they were offline completely. They were destroyed. There was that whole series of censorship acts undertaken in the name of stopping Trump, his white nationalist movement. And then we immediately went into the COVID pandemic, kind of simultaneously, where for
Yeah.
2 years we've been conditioned to accept more and more censorship. The idea that if you question or deviate from the pronouncements of the World Health Organization or Anthony Fauci, you deserve to be removed from the internet on the grounds that you're spreading dangerous disinformation, even though so many of the things they ended up saying turned out to be false. So we had those two events justifying censorship. Now we have this war where we're seeing previously unthinkable censorship. I mean, Google removed RT and Sputnik from all of Europe from YouTube. So people who are watching those Russian news outlets to see what the Russians are saying, to compare it to what the West is saying and decide what they want to believe, were no longer able to access it. I think the most disturbing thing is that the EU just promulgated new regulations or laws that require social media companies and search engines to ban and delete any information that comes from any Russian outlet. So the first account that actually found that Victoria Nuland testimony we've been talking about, I was actually working on putting my clip together, but RT was watching obviously live and they put it out first. And so a bunch of people took that RT clip and spread it around because it wasn't doctored. It was the actual video of Victoria Nuland saying this. And people were concerned about that. Under EU law, any person who did that is violating the law, and social media companies and search engines are required to delete them. Required, not optional at all. And so now if you look at Twitter, if you look at Google, if you look at Facebook, all throughout Europe, you cannot find RT, you cannot find Sputnik, not because those platforms decided to do that, which would be bad enough, but because the government mandated it. We're talking about a level now of censorship being directed by the state. This happened too. Democrats have been summoning, Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and Google executives to the Congress and the Senate and threatening them. If you don't censor more, you're going to face legal and regulatory reprisals. We're talking now about state influence, state coerced, state directed censorship of the internet in the West in the name of preserving and defending democracy.
It makes no sense. That reminds me of when I was growing up in the UAE trying to get on YouTube. All these different kind of shows, even just Western shows, were completely blocked out. You couldn't even find them whatsoever. So it doesn't, when you're claiming to be a nation or a society of liberty and freedom and everything, that the basic sense of liberty is information flow. In my mind, the freedom flow of information, thoughts, all of that kind of stuff means liberty to me, because you're allowing other people to think for themselves, see for themselves, and make their own decisions instead of trying to propagate your own narrative within their heads. And I think that's what they're trying to do. And a lot of people here, and it's not just a left thing as well, it's a left and a right thing. If they can control you and control what you think, they'll go for it and they'll do it. Like, the government is not here to protect you. It's here to try and control you.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly alarming. I think incomparably alarming, because as you say, if you can control what people understand, what information they receive about the world, you can control completely what they think and what they conclude, because they just don't have access to the other information that would let them question or doubt what it is that you're telling them. You create a closed system of information. You can manipulate people to believe anything that you want them to believe. And, that it's what's really alarming about it is, I don't know if you had this experience, but I know growing up into my teens and young adulthood, you read history or you read about other countries where there's this grave repression, the UAE being a good example, countries like Saudi Arabia or China or whatever that we're taught to view as so despotic and repressive. And you wonder, how is it that the people of those countries can tolerate that, can want that, cannot realize that the way they're being manipulated is so dangerous. And you see it now, where people in the West, not only aren't they rising up in anger at the way that their information diet is being policed and censored, they're begging for more. Right. You would think that if there were a censorship regime being imposed by the state and corporate power, journalists would be the first ones standing up and saying, no, we stand for the First Amendment. And not just technically the First Amendment, but the values behind it, the idea that it's always better to have more information, not less. Journalists are the ones who have been the leading agitators for the censorship regime. And if you go on Twitter now, or you write an article talking about this censorship, you'll see people in the West, how they justify it. They say, this information is too dangerous. It's disinformation about COVID. It'll kill people. this information shouldn't be seen because it spreads lies about the election, or it, elevates and empowers Donald Trump's fascist white supremacist movement. So that should be suppressed. And now, of course, we shouldn't allow propaganda by evil countries like Russia and China. We're grateful that this is being kept away from us and from everybody else. You see how easily people are convinced not to view it as censorship, to view it as something else, is to view it as this kind of public service, making society safer by repressing information they're led to believe is dangerous just to allow to circulate. And I don't wonder anymore how populations can tolerate it or even be grateful for it, because you see it in action.
Yeah, one of the biggest threats to any government is a person's ability to use critical thinking. It's very true. When you have a population of people who can't be fooled, that really spells disaster for that particular government and their claim to power. But I want to move on to some Rumble rants. We have History Speaks.
Suraj, can you please
Rumble.
move on to some Rumble rants? I've been patiently waiting for you to get there. Your audience, you need to respect your audience. Like, they have questions, they appear, they pay, they like want to be heard, and you're just talking. So I think it's time to get to the Rumble rant.
How is Glenn dunking harder on me than any Habibi that's ever been on this show?
That's why I came back. That's the only reason.
I respect it. I respect it. So History Speaks says, Glenn, do you still believe the GOP has realigned into an anti-war position? There is no prominent GOP anti-war figure, and it was Trump who got us involved militarily in this war by arming Ukraine.
Well, so first of all, I mean, I've been making the argument forever that the reason why the whole conspiracy theory about Trump being controlled by the Russians is so preposterous is if you look at what Trump has actually done, he's been more confrontational toward Moscow, certainly, than President Obama was. He did flood Ukraine with lethal weapons, which is one of the most challenging things you could do to Russian vital interest, while Obama refused to do it on the grounds that Ukraine wasn't a vital interest to the United States, but is to Russia. He also spent 2 years trying to sabotage in every way he could the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was crucial to Russian economic growth, because they were going to sell enormous amounts of cheap natural gas to Germany and then to Western Europe. Something obviously very odd behavior from a Russian asset or somebody controlled by blackmail to attack the two greatest sources of vital interest for Russia, namely Ukraine and that pipeline. So I agree completely that the Trump administration was far more confrontational with Ukraine, with Russia, than the Obama administration was, which is why I found that conspiracy theory so moronic. And it's scandalous that the media didn't stop and say, wait, how can it be that this is true, what we're saying, at the same time while Trump is doing this? What I do think, though, is that Trump came in, remember, running in 2016, the first time any major Republican Party candidate has done so, by denouncing virtually all of Republican foreign policy going back to Reagan. He talked about how the Iraq War was the worst mistake that we ever made, even though there's questions about what he was saying at the time. He said trying to overthrow the Assad government in Syria is lunacy. Why should we care if Assad governs? We should work with Assad to fight common enemies. He said regime change wars like in Libya do a grave disservice to the American public by sacrificing our welfare and our people's lives for countries that we have no business trying to manage. And so not only that, but he was incredibly vicious toward the CIA and the FBI, calling them liars, mocking them for getting WMD wrong, things we never heard a Republican candidate do before, or even a Democratic candidate do before. And not only did he do it, but he won. He won the GOP nomination and then the presidency, never really changing that message. And so obviously that fostered a lot of doubt and skepticism on the part of his followers toward institutions that were once untouchable in Republican politics, like the CIA, like the Pentagon, like the FBI. And it's oversimplified to say, oh, now the GOP is an anti-war isolationist party. Of course they're not. And as we talked about earlier, there's very little dissent within the Republican Party now. But that's just because the politics are so overwhelmingly on the side of Ukraine and against Russia that no politician could really survive if they wanted to step in front of that train. But you do see, if you want to find, media, prominent media that is challenging the NATO CIA line on Russia and Ukraine, you don't go to the left to find that. It's not there. CNN and MSNBC are fully on board with that message. You go to the right, you go to Fox News, you go to Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham in particular, who have been and continue to be very skeptical about the U.S. narrative about this war, and especially about the rationale for U.S. involvement. So I think you're seeing politically on the right this dissent, even though among lawmakers, among elected officials, they're pretty much the same as Democrats.
Scott Jonesy with a Rumble rant says, by supplying more weapons to Ukraine, aren't we prolonging the inevitable Putin win? And will it only result in more deaths and destruction?
I mean, to me, it seems so clear that that's our objective, in part because the United States government is all but saying it explicitly. And it's not as though that is beneath us or we're too good for such an immoral strategy. That is exactly what we did in Syria. We armed the rebels just enough to prolong the war, to prevent Assad from winning, but never armed them enough for them to actually win. So we ensured that war just went on forever, bogged down Russia, bogged down Assad, ate up billions of dollars in money to weapons manufacturers, and made sure that Syria was destroyed over the course of many years. We did the same thing in Afghanistan in the 1980s when we funded and armed the Mujahideen in order to keep the Soviet Union trapped in Afghanistan by arming an insurgency. Obviously, in both cases, those weapons, as we talked about before, fell into very extremist hands and caused a lot of problems for the United States. I don't think anyone believes that the Ukrainians are going to win. And even if they could win in the sense of expelling Russia from their territory, I really, would be, thinking about what Putin would do in the case of that Ukraine won, obviously with the help of a lot of countries in the West, including the United States, is really alarming. But I think that the idea is not to defend and protect Ukraine and Ukrainians, but to sacrifice them by creating a years-long insurgency war that traps Russia in there, destroys the country of Ukraine and the lives of the people in it, just like the U.S. did in Syria and Afghanistan. And I think that's clearly what the objective is.
History Speaks with another Rumble rant says, Russiagate, though dumb, did not cause U.S. war hysteria in Ukraine. Trump administration itself began U.S. policy of arming Ukraine, and GOP skeptics of Russiagate agree with Dems on this issue. I want to move over to some of our comments from our questions from our Habibi Discord server. If you're watching, there's a link to join the Habibi Discord server below. This is from Blake By, who is a councilman in Hillsborough, Kansas, and should absolutely resign. Don't you agree?
100%.
I've had a petition for his resignation. He's so corrupt. He's
so corrupt,
abusing his power constantly.
Taking kickbacks.
He has people who work for him in his cabinet, working in his home, all kinds of really dirty things.
Can't have this.
Insane.
Anyways, his question, he says, what steps can the Biden administration do right now to get the price of gas back to a stable level again? I know this may seem like a simple question, but I think it's going to take more than just reopening the Keystone XL pipeline.
Well, I mean, we could also continue to buy oil and gas from Russia. And these sanctions now are about to be improved by an overwhelming. They were just approved by an overwhelming majority in the House. 15 Republicans joined Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush to vote no, and everybody else voted yes. So presumably these sanctions are going to be instituted. I think if you look at the polls, Americans are so wrapped up in the emotionalism of this war that they say, if you ask them, are you willing to sacrifice for Ukraine? And they're like, totally. I want to see, a month from now, when gas is at, $6 a gallon or whatever, and food prices are through the roof.
It's already $6.
How enduring that willingness is to sacrifice for Ukraine. I guess we're going to find out.
I think that's the dumbest thing that somebody can say is I'm willing to sacrifice for you. That's so stupid. They want you poor. They want you to harm yourself. They're not the ones who are making the sacrifice.
Stephen Colbert and George Takei, both of them are like, no, you have to sacrifice. The freedom is not free. Same with that John Avlon, who was on CNN. He used to run the Daily Beast, and there's this 2018 New York Times profile in the style section about the gigantic sprawling mansion in Manhattan that he and his wife, the granddaughter of Herbert Hoover, occupy, that used to be owned by the Astor family. So he goes home to this multi-million-dollar, incredibly flamboyant townhouse that the New York Times profiled in its style section. And then he takes, a a chauffeured car to the CNN studio, and he goes on TV all coiffed and manicured and blown dry, and he's like, "Hey, you pigs out there complaining about higher gas and food prices, you need to shut the fuck up because freedom is not free."
Right.
This
my
is
favorite.
you see Team America World Police, right? Freedom isn't free. It takes folks like you and me. It's got the freedom costs $1.05.
It's a buck
Straight out of that.
That's what it is. My favorite one was Pete Buplug when he was talking about just go and buy an electric car. Like it's something completely easy for a mother with like, a van worthy amount of kids to take to school or soccer practice to just drop 30 to 50K on a new electric car. It's just so tone deaf, absolute tone deaf. And it's, to me, I feel like it's the point. Like it's their goal. They want people to have to change their lifestyle, and they're going to force it onto people no matter how many people have to suffer for it.
Yeah, and then after they do that stuff, they're like, why don't people trust us? Why does everyone hate us?
We got 2 more questions from the audience. This is from Hobby Cliv on the Habibi Discord server. He says, what are the odds of Putin surviving this? What of Zelensky? Do you believe Biden is doing enough, or is there fighting within his administration?
I think not only will Putin likely survive, I think we want him to survive, if for no other reason that Russia is an incredibly significant country with a vast stockpile of dangerous weapons. And if Putin isn't surviving, we have no idea who comes next and how they function and how they think and what vacuum gets created. The last thing I think we should want is instability in Russia. If I had my way, if I were running foreign policy, my attitude toward this war would be that it's wrong for Russia to have invaded. We denounce that invasion. At some point, maybe we, the United States, will also abide by those standards that we're promulgating for others. And that beyond that, it's too dangerous for us to be involved, especially since there's very little we can do that's not insane, that can actually shape the outcome of the conflict in a way that actually helps Ukrainians.
And obviously you have the whole war in Yemen happening with basically a Saudi coalition in the United States. It just never ends. But one of the final questions from the Habibi Discord server, this comes from Joshin. He says, what are some methods people can use to filter the actual news from the propaganda?
I think the best thing you can do is simply apply skepticism and your faculties of reason to whatever it is that you're hearing. So if you're hearing something from the government, from the media, even if it's something that most people believe, just put a kind of marker in your own brain that you're not going to believe it until you're shown evidence that it's true. No matter how convincing it might seem, no matter how many people who you trust are affirming it, so often that's where not just error, but deliberate manipulation and deceit lies, is in making claims that are said in an authoritative tone that are unaccompanied by evidence. And that's true whether the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians or media figures or anybody are saying it, including, the Habibis. Like, demand evidence from them. They lie constantly. And I think that just the state of mind that you formulate when you interact with the news is probably the most important thing you could do. And then obviously you should definitely seek out on purpose dissent in the other side at all times.
Well spoken and well said. Glenn Greenwald, who is the host of System Update, which you can catch here exclusively on Rumble. He's the author of Securing Democracy. Glenn, what's next up for you? What's the next big story you're working on?
I don't preview my stories, especially for shitty podcasts like this one, but you'll have to wait until the stories come out.
Yeah, afterwards, nothing. We don't get any exclusive spills.
Nothing.
On a show like this.
If you subscribe, you'll read it, and if you don't, it's fine.
Well, Glenn, we really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today, coming back to the show specifically to dunk on me again. His cake.
It was
Glenn,
more
number
enjoyable
one.
than I expected. Thank you for the cake, though. Sincerely, I really appreciate it.
I will mail this to you in Brazil. You just gotta post your address publicly, and it should be there.
All right. I'll go tweet it out right now.
That's great.
All
Well,
right,
thank
good
you so
talking to
much.
guys.
And for everyone else, you could go ahead and sub to us on Locals as well as our Rumble channel. I'm Suraj Hashmi.
I'm Jack Kobe.
We're the Habibi Bros. We'll see you next week on the BB Power Hour. Peace here. Mess of them.